Hey everybody, so today we're going to be going over the Path of Exile 2 upcoming changes and improvements. This will be the first medium-sized patch, the first kind of content patch that the early access will be getting. The last patch that went over was just a minor rebalancing of some things that were extraordinarily overpowered and are still actually, despite the community's insistence, are actually still a little bit overpowered and still are going to be getting a little bit nerfed. At any rate, this is kind of their first content patch. It's adding some support gems, rebalancing some abilities, adjusting a lot of things we talked about in the last update. And so we're just going to be going through that. As always, before I go into this, I like to take my time and really talk about things, not just kind of recap them. Don't think this is just a 10-minute recap, but more me just going over my thoughts and a lot of different things. So it's helpful to remind people, you don't have to just sit here and watch until you get bored. You can use me as a podcast, put me in a second monitor, just listen along. Be on your phone. The joke I always use, you can be on your phone while you listen to me and pretend that you're paying attention. But at any rate, so Path of Exile launched into its early access, and the player base at large seems to be getting out of the campaign and into the maps right now. Now, as they get out of the campaign and they get into the maps, they're going to be noticing a couple of issues. The gameplay is massively changing in that instead of a fewer amount of enemies that you kind of combo to kill, you're now dealing with a spam of enemies that you just spam AoE on. Now, the player base at large probably hasn't realized that the diversity of builds is going to massively decrease as everything comes down to how many AoEs per second you can put out. But the one thing they have noticed is that they're getting one shot a lot. They're getting killed constantly. So between the campaign maps often feeling too large for people and maps kind of starting with way too much damage and being kind of difficult to even enter, you'll start doing maps and then you just get killed over and over and over and over and over again. And in addition to that, there's some support gems right now that are just not worth using because mathematically they just don't make any sense at all. So let's start going over this. That's my opinion with the game, and that's in my opinion where the state of the game is. So let's see what they do to adjust that. Like we mentioned last week, we'll be adding a capacity to fast travel between checkpoints within an area, as well as adding many more checkpoints to areas. Generally at all entrances and exits to areas, meaning if you find these first, you'll be able to instantly travel to them to continue exploring. So that's just on the larger campaign maps. You'll be able to fast travel between the different checkpoints and check out different areas, which especially means if you made a wrong turn, there's no like it's probably not 3 to 4 minutes. There's no like minute and a half downtime of you just walking across the entire map. I personally like the larger windy maps. It reminds me of more older ARPGs before everything kind of became so streamlined. In older games, it was more about exploration and attacking enemies, not so much sprinting through zones, AoEing everything, sprinting through zones, AoEing everything. And so Path of Exile 2, at the very least, the campaign, not the late game, seems to be going more to that kind of style where things are going to be slower. You're going to actually have to fight enemies, engage with them, not just AoE them all to death. In the maps, this changes substantially, but at least in the campaign, that seems to be the pacing they want. But they don't want you missing a turn, and then all of a sudden, you're down like 2 minutes as you're just running across the whole map going, oh, it was that area that I needed to go to. We'll also be making passive point respeccing cheaper, especially at higher levels. It hit a relatively aggressive curve, getting more expensive with character level. We have flattened that curve so it doesn't exponentially grow as much. This should generally result in an approximately 40 to 50% less gold cost for respeccing between the start and middle of endgame progression. So it's hard for me to read sometimes. I have dyslexia, not hard dyslexia. You probably have seen that sometimes with how I read things out of order. I notice every time I do it. You probably notice it. Anyway, let's move on. I do think in like the hyper late game, you do get enough gold to respec. The argument that you don't have enough gold to respec, I'm sitting on so much gold I could respec and respec back. In fact, I think a recurring problem is going to be that people are going to spec into AoE builds, spam clear the maps, and then every time they get to the pinnacle bosses, they're just going to spec right into a single target build, do the boss, and then spec back out again, because it's really not actually that expensive to change around even 10, 20 nodes, really. You could probably change 30. It would really would not take that much farming. And so I do think keeping the end game progression costs the same is good, but yeah, throughout the rest of the game, especially when you're using gold to gamble and buy loot and try to keep your character up to date, it can be a bit detrimental to try to have to actually also afford respecs if your build wasn't that good. So I don't mind this so much. This is probably a good change. I don't agree with the people though that think respecking should be way easy. It should obviously be expensive and difficult, and even now it's not that expensive. I think it should just be a little bit more lenient so people can experiment with their builds more, because not everyone knows what they're going to do before they go into the game. A lot of people that play these sorts of games don't really know what they're going to do. They say, I'm going to play the warrior, and they put points in damage, oops, and they're getting one shot. And then they think, okay, well, I have enough damage, but let me take some of these points away from damage, maybe go into some survivability, you know, however little survivability remains. The Trial of Sekhemas. I forgot to mention this earlier. The Trial of Sekhemas. Boy, this is that trial this is the one with honor. It's not fair, and they're not really making it fair. The problem is melee characters, close range characters, tend to focus more on healing and not really avoiding damage so much as trading damage with the opposing monsters. The problem is this trial, you have honor. Every time you hit, you lose honor. Range characters have been managing to clear these trials without really that much of an issue, whereas melee characters slowly get whittled away on honor as time progresses until they lose. Basically, melee characters are taking a lot longer time to do their ascensions because you need to do these trials to get your ascension points, which means that melee characters, warriors in particular, who are already very weak early game, double suffer because they can't even get their ascension points. I think I'm almost level 90 and I still haven't gotten to my 8th ascension points. So figure that one out. Players were finding the Trial of Sekhemas particularly frustrating in close range, so we've reworked how honor damage scales when in close range, as well as fixing an important bug that was causing players to take far too much honor damage from damage over time. Honor damage now scales based on distance to enemies. When in close range, you'll take 35% less honor damage, tapering off as you are further from monsters. So I actually think this should be like straight 50%. I think the developers don't really realize the primary way you lose this trial as melee isn't that you're being killed, it's that you literally just get whittled away. Warriors have such long cast times on their abilities that every time they go to cast an ability, a little scorpion or something walks up and hits you with its little leg, and sure, you lose 5 honor, but it's 5 here, 7 there, 10 here, 5 here, and all of a sudden you're down hundreds of honor when you have only got a couple hundred honor in the early game, and you realize that you can't really complete the trial anymore. And so I think the 35% less honor from being in close range, it's like a good band-aid, but it doesn't really solve the problem here, which is melee needs, or often does, hit trade due to either being in melee or having long cast times that doesn't really work with how this trial works. Fixed a bug where damage over time was applying thrice as much damage to honor as intended, and fixed a bug where honor resistance was only applying to 2/3 of the damage. So this should mean that honor resistance will be better. I stacked a lot of honor resistance and I was kind of weirded out at the time because I had so much honor resistance. I had like 60, 70, 80% honor resistance, and yet despite that, I was still taking so much honor damage. I was so confused. And so this bug definitely makes sense to me. As for the dots applying 3 times as much honor damage, that also makes sense to me. So as you continue to try through these trials, you can get items that will slowly give you honor resistance. And what you do is you stack all these honor resistance items. This is my tip to you, by the way, if you've ever tried this. Stack all these honor resistance items, and that's how you can actually get through as a melee character in some of these. Now, this doesn't really fix the issue of melee are just inherently off at a huge disadvantage. Warriors in particular can't really use any of their abilities. Normally what would happen is a warrior would start channeling his huge AoE, then he would take some damage, then he would hit it, he'd kill the enemies, he'd probably heal on his passive from killing enemies, and then he wouldn't even care that he took that tiny little bit of damage. But in here, you do definitely take honor damage from doing that, and it just adds up slowly. Even if it's 35% slower, it still means that it feels very, very bad to play warrior because you don't want to use any of your abilities because all of them cast so long that a little dude will just walk up and tap you, and it's not going to do anything to your actual health bar. It's just going to hit your honor. So there are 3 changes here to 3 different enemy types that were kind of being really frustrating in this. Skitter golems no longer use basic attacks and instead now just explode. Serpent Clan's burrow and ambush attack has had improved visual telegraphing and cannot be used from as far as away. So these are the dudes, they burrowed underground and then they jumped up underneath you. They often wouldn't kill you. Once again, they just whittled away your honor. Skitter golems would just whittle away your honor as well. So particularly imagine playing melee and you got these serpents are burrowing under and then teleporting under you and then hitting you. Everything's just whittling away your honor. The Trial of Sekhemas is absolutely terrible. There's no defending this. And despite the fact that they're patching it, I think they should literally patch it to be way too easy temporarily as a stopgap. Basically, literally make it so that it's like dramatically easier on melee to the point where range can basically complete it for free. Because melee right now is having such a ludicrously tough time of it. It's not even remotely fun or interesting for anyone. It's a disaster. It is immensely unfun. Lastly, here we have volcanoes created by the Rattle Cage's Fissure Slime now last half the duration, which is good because once again, it would just create volcanoes that would spew out little lava and then you would take damage from the little lava. It wasn't a lot of damage, but it was a little. Okay. So here we have endgame and monster balance. A lot of people did notice you entered the end game and you got one shot. And you enter and you get one shot. And then you got one shot. And then you got one shot. And then you got one shot. The one-shotting in endgame is pretty brutal. A lot of people would play through the entire campaign. And there is an absolutely ludicrous power spike in enemies going from the game itself to the end game. Now, in the end game, there's a problem where the enemies very rarely gain HP. Because they very, very, very rarely gain HP, they just gain more numbers of enemies and they get more damage, like a lot more damage. This means in the campaign, you've primarily leveled up maybe by all the different abilities you have. Some abilities are debuffs, combos, bleeds, all this stuff. Once you reach the end game, you'll notice that only two things are important. How much AoE can you do and how much can you tank? So right as you reach the end game, the game takes a dramatically different shift. It's very weird, and I'm not really sure what happened here. At any rate, a lot of people are just straight up, in the community at large is reaching endgame right now, and they are just dying repeatedly until they quit the game. The community doesn't really, like, the players, the veterans of Path of Exile 1 don't really want to talk about it. I don't know why they don't want to talk about it, but this endgame style, where basically all builds outside of AoE spam become immediately irrelevant, that style of gameplay is not good, nor is it healthy. If the only thing that matters is how many AoEs per second you can do, you're going to invalidate like 90% of builds in the game, especially because in this game, they added so many builds that are focused on comboing and so many builds that are focusing on debuffing and stalling the game and doing stuff like that. They just aren't really viable anymore in the late game. It's very weird for me. Now, they aren't addressing the larger issue, and it remains to be seen to me if they intend this to be the actual late game or if they want the late game to have more build variety. As of now, based on the fact that the further into the late game you go, you just start fighting more enemies and they never really get any healthier. It does lead me to believe that this is how they intend the game to be played. That basically you have the campaign, and the campaign is a slower game, the more Souls-like game. That's the one where you can have a variety of different builds and be, playing the game how you want it to be. It seems they want the end game to just be AoE mashing. Look no further than Breaches, where you literally will have to change your build because the amount of enemies you have to kill a second during Breach is literally impossible for certain build styles. So people will have to swap their builds just to continue to progress through the late game. But at any rate, they have done some changes about the getting one shot, because the damage and enemies, basically during the campaign, an enemy that could kill you very quickly, there'd be one, maybe two of them at the map at a time. Because there's so many enemies in the endgame content, you could have 4, 5, 6 enemies who could one-shot you at a time. And it gets pretty brutal, especially because the death penalty is massive in the endgame. You lose your map, you lose all bonuses to that map node, you lose some XP. It's outrageously difficult on your progression when you actually end up dying in the endgame. And it's very easy to die right now. A lot of players, and again, I really want to emphasize this. A lot of people are playing the campaign, going into the end game, getting absolutely massacred because their build is not just an AoE spamming, which the developers seem to have pushed. They pushed lots of builds. Like for Warrior, they pushed these shield builds. They pushed builds focused more on the slower armor pen. They focused a lot of builds on the slower, huge wind-up AoEs, and a lot of Warrior players In particular, I know because I play them, and a lot of people come up into my chat and they're like, oh, how are you actually doing this stuff? A lot of warrior players literally don't know what to do because all of a sudden the game just pulled a 180 at them. We went from like this slow-paced game and it pulled off its mask and was like, aha, it's Path of Exile 1 again. And a lot of people just weren't prepared for that, especially, again, with just how much damage is in the game, how fast-paced it starts to become. Maps no longer have additional elemental resistance penalties inherently applied to tier 6 and tier 11 or higher maps. It is now consistent across the endgame. I think this is probably a good solution, even though it dramatically buffs the player. The problem is the damage spikes that you start taking in the endgame are ridiculous, and you have to continuously gear only to get tankier. Now, the only problem I have with this is there's no reason to do anything really but to gear to get tankier. I'm still using the weapon I had at the beginning of, I think I was maybe at tier 4 and 5 maps when I started doing my build. I quick got a weapon for it, and I've never swapped it, and I'm still one-shotting everything on the map. The enemies only get more numerous, but they don't get tankier, which means that if you have an AoE, your AoE will just continue to clear everything. This is a serious actual issue, because especially with no longer needing more elemental resistance, like, what exactly are you gearing for? Because you don't really need to do more damage. You will reach resistance cap, at which point, unless you have energy shield, you're really only gearing to get more health, which means that the only thing to really do is to go to the marketplace and just look at the items with the biggest health, and that's not exactly exciting. There's not really that many modifiers in Path of Exile on items that are that exciting or really even that interesting to get. It's, for the most part, it's resistances. Get lots of it. Okay. Now, it is good, again, that you can maybe go to different stats on your gear other than just trying to get double resistance on every single gear slot. The only problem, again, is, but what exactly am I going for then? It does reduce the burden on people to have perfect gear. Not needing to have 20 more resistances by tier 11 does mean, yes, you do not need perfect gear, and so you won't be needing to go to the auction house. Warriors in particular were hit bad by this. I keep mentioning warriors because, yes, they are really struggling right now. The main thing to do with warrior was to either get really lucky on loot rolls or to go to the marketplace and just start buying all the items to get tanky enough. And the thing is, everyone else is also buying these tanky items, but not everyone else needed them. Warriors needed them because they have to run into melee, and their job is much more difficult. There are some warrior builds that can just try to AoE everything, but it's not entirely obvious to new players in particular that the end game is literally just an AoE fest. Considering how much of the campaign was played with all these different builds, that the end game being only about how big are your AoEs on warrior, a lot of people just, they haven't figured that out. I don't really think it should even be that way. It really shouldn't. It's such a weird change. Chaos damage now scales less aggressively over the end game, and this is ridiculous. I actually think I did the math, and when you do the math, you actually do notice multiple of the chaos damage effects in the end game were actually doing 10,000 plus damage. I do not know why. The little purple orbs that followed you around could actually one-shot you. This dramatically screwed with melee because it meant melee has these giant cast type abilities that they couldn't use because you've got these little purple orbs that if they ever touch you, kill you. So you can't stop moving, which works fine for the range classes. They don't stop moving. Literally, they can attack while moving, but melee can't attack while moving, which is a curious design choice. But at any rate, if the melee characters try to cast any abilities, the purple orbs that are falling, then just go and you're dead. So you had to stack your resistances to full, or the mages in the back would one-shot you. Then you need to stack your chaos resistance to full, or the little purple orbs would one-shot you. There are also some chaos archers that could literally kill you from full HP before you even dodge rolled away. That's true. I have footage. I have the footage. I caught it in 4K. I literally dodge rolled away from their attack before it even landed, and it killed me from full HP. So yes, hopefully chaos damage does scale less aggressively over the late game. These two are good changes. I'm just a bit worried, as always, that what exactly is there left to itemize for? You don't need more damage. You won't need more resistances. So I guess you could just put it into funny stats, and that's fine. I mean, if you put it into things like spirit, but then I'm wondering, do we really have enough abilities needing spirit that are really that interesting right now? But we'll see. Critical strikes from monsters now deal 40% less damage. This kind of disappoints me in a way, because the only thing warriors had on other people was they had the one node where they could take the 200% of their armor applied to crits. So crits would hit them for double damage, but they would get double the armor applying to it. So that was like one of the biggest advantages of playing warriors was crits. I could take any crit map and it was fine. I literally didn't even notice it, right? But spells do crit, and in general, yeah, I mean, monsters end up dealing so much damage and there's so many of them. It's pretty frequent that it would lose a map just because like 3 mages would just happen to crit in a row. And before you say, you know, why are you getting hit that much? Well, you do have to tank some damage as a warrior. Sometimes if you're using the slam abilities, you do need to take damage. You do need a damage trade with the enemies. So at a certain point, it did suck when, especially like in breaches and things like that, where there's like 100 mobs attacking you. Like eventually some of the range mobs are just gonna chain their crits together. Like it's just math. Like eventually it'll happen. Lowered the baseline monster density from the breach encounter, primarily by reducing the frequency of the elite monsters appearing. So I disagree with this entirely. I think the breach problem is that there's too many normal monsters. Like you literally have to kill like 10 a second. I do have builds and I have gotten through them and I am clearing tier 15 maps, no problem. But why are there so many monsters? What is happening? There aren't, like, the problem is there are many slow builds currently in the game that were designed to be slow, that could be fun to play. But once you reach breaches, the first time you do a breach, you're going to think, oh, well, that build's not viable. Oh, screw that. Because you're just not doing enough AoEs per second. The elite monsters should probably have been more frequent, and it should have been the normal monsters that get reduced to like literally half of what they are right now. At the very least, the ranged enemies should be toned down because, oh boy, I mean, you can eventually get body blocked by so many of the melee that enough ranged people will start to attack you that you start casting an ability to try to AoE the melee dudes, and like 5 mages are all chucking bolts at you the whole time. Disabled the volatile crystals modifier. We'll revisit this in a future pending telegraphing improvements. So volatile crystals was when a monster died, it dropped death spores, and then they one-shot you. Now look, I have 3,500 HP. I have 75% chaos resist, and this stuff would still do over 2/3 my HP. And every time I would think to myself, wow, this would literally kill any other class. Well, not energy shield users, but energy shield is bizarrely overpowered right now, and I'm not really sure why it's not being nerfed. At any rate, any warrior who wasn't geared, any monk who wasn't geared, any archer, crossbowman who wasn't geared, they would all be dead. And this did kill people a lot. It was really dumb and frustrating, and I'm not really sure why I was even in the game. They must have never loaded up the game and played against it even once. Okay. Purple explosions created by the volatile plants modifier or on rare monsters now deal significantly less damage. This is good. Now, I think this should also apply to the ones in rituals. If you ever do a ritual and you get the plants that are giving the purple explosives, they mean you cannot cast abilities. Now, once again, I have dealt with it. I have created builds. I have created playstyles where I can dodge around and still be meleeing while dodging them. It's very high octane gameplay. It's very intense. Much more intense than ranged people who deal with it. But the problem is, it's a modifier that effectively stops you from trying to cast long cast time abilities, which warrior has a lot of. So all those long cast time abilities kind of just get invalidated when the purple explosives are nearby. Now, it is good that they're doing significantly less damage. That's a very good change. So let me just clarify here for anyone who thinks I'm being too negative. All of these are very good changes, in my opinion. Maybe this one is a bit debatable. I think the regular enemies should have been reduced by like half or more, and the elite enemies should have been the primarily ones. They should have been the big encounters, let's say, where the lower damage characters could have focused more on the big monsters. The AoEers still would have an outrageous, even at half, you would still have an outrageous amount of things to AoE, but the characters who are a bit slower could actually clear breach. I think breach is literally a funnel right now. It's really bad for game design when you have a funnel encounter. You need breach to do some endgame. And the problem is that you just can't, the amount of enemies you need to kill per second is simply out of some build's control. yeah, I mean, any build that focuses on damage over time is going to, unless they add some ways for them to AoE, but then we're just getting into the problem where is everything just an AoE build, right? Because then all the builds are going to start being really samey. If everything is just to kill everything in an AoE build, then some builds are just going to be samey, which is not, again, that's Path of Exile 1, and that's great, but in Path of Exile 2, the campaign kind of promised that the different builds are going to be different. This isn't just going to be the AoE game, right? But here we are. Okay. But this is good. This is good. All of these are really good. I think this is going to make maps a lot better for people. I wish there was some more challenging content at the end of the end game. I have kind of, I'm not really like best in slot or anything like that, but I'm certainly at the point where unless I roll bad map modifiers, I can kind of just troll through it. I still do get one shot a couple times by some of these jank mechanics, so we'll see what happens with that one. But yeah. So at the very least, this purple explosive change, this alone means I might be able to try some of these slower slam builds now, instead of doing the only high octane gameplay. If you look at some of my streams, you'll see what I'm doing is pretty jank. It probably shouldn't even be allowed, but you know, given what I'm up against, this is what I have to do. The Siphon's Flask Charges modifier on monsters now drains 10 times less flask charges per second. This was unintentionally draining way too many charges. So I did notice this. Every so often, a rare monster that had the flask charge drain would literally just run up to you. They'd literally just run up to you and all your flasks would be gone. And you could die because all of a sudden you have no flasks. Combined with some certain other things that they could have, this could just obliterate you. Now, there are, probably right now, there are probably way too many anti-melee modifiers on rare monsters. It's pretty unfortunate, but basically every single time I get a rare monster at this point, I don't even try to fight it in melee anymore. I basically just try to charge up a Hammer of the Gods and one-shot it at range. Because so many melee monsters right now, I mean, how many modifiers are there that obliterate range? There's Siphon Flask changes, bleed, poison. If they do a lot of damage, getting hit by that can also screw with you. There's the ice aura, the chrono aura, slowing you down when you get close to them. Sometimes I have literally found myself unable to deal damage to them because I'm so slowed by their aura. Like my attacks get reduced to like half speed, and then there's lightning charges going around. So every time I almost complete an attack, I have to dodge roll out of the lightning. So, like, there are some rare monsters who, like, melee, like, you can kill them, obviously. I'm not saying they're unkillable, but it's like, you practically have to just not interact with them. You just have to, like, one-shot them with a hammer from range, which surely that could not have been intended, that so many rare monsters just don't, like, you just don't interact with them in melee. These changes should generally result in an endgame that is much more survivable than before, and will continue to address problematic cases as they arise. This is good. This is all good. This is all good. I literally didn't know what was going to happen. Once people got bored of keeping up their gear on the auction house or the marketplace, whatever you want to call it, and once those items that were mostly good but not really worth caring about, that people just put up for one exalted, once those left the marketplace, I didn't really know what warriors were going to do. You reach the end game, and the best thing you can do is try to find a bunch of gear with worth one exalted orb, and you just buy some gear, get some resistance, get some HP, and try to stop yourself from getting one shot over and over. But you couldn't really do that because the end game was just one shotting you over and over. So I really hope they at the very least tone down the beginning of the end game pretty hard, so that the classes who need to actually go into melee aren't walking up and getting killed, losing their map, losing all their progress, and going, oh, that sucked. Okay, character and item balance. We've made charm, modifiers, and belts substantially more common and now appear at lower levels. The of symbolism modifier now appears from level 23 onwards, and the of inscription modifier now appears from level 64 onwards. So charms are good for beating certain ailments and things that are killing you. So if you're dying to chaos damage all the time, you can get a chaos charm. If you're dying to freeze, you can get an anti-freeze charm, things like that. The only problem is you would only ever have one, ever. Belts could roll more, but it was only level 82 plus. So that surely was not great from the developers. It does, of course, take one of your modifier slots on the item itself, but a lot of builds will enjoy For example, I know I would very much enjoy being able to have an anti-freeze charm so that I don't get randomly frozen. And I don't think I've died in a freeze in a while, but I sure keep getting close. So Electrocute is now 25% harder to build up, but the damage penalty has been removed from the support gem. So Electrocute and Freeze were a little bit too easy, and a lot of people were using procs on Electrocute and on Freeze to do absolutely outrageous things that were borderline illegal. The developers continue to hammer down these builds, but all I can say is watching people do these builds, it really feels like they're playing a different game than me, and I don't have a better way to put it. It feels like Warriors are playing a different game from everyone else. The problem is that their game does look fun for them. Them playing their game does look fun, but me playing my game, it is kind of fun. The only problem is, going forwards, the developers are going to need to decide who are they balancing. Which game are they balancing for? The game where people are slow and have slow cast time abilities and combo, or the game where they're running around with bows, AoEing the entire map down, never even stopping, running past everything, two-shotting it, killing rares in 1 second. Like, if that's the game they're balancing for, then it's going to very quickly run into an issue where the other game, the warrior game, the slow cast time, the debuff game, the dot game, they're not really going to be able to clear content or compete, because the developers do want challenging content at the end game. And if that content is balanced on what certain builds can do, then the builds who aren't even close to those builds aren't going to be able to compete. So as compared to Path of Exile 1, I think the developers are going to need to put more effort into balancing. I'm not sure if they have it in them. Historically, I think a lot of people can agree they've never really... Sorry, I got my nose itching. A lot of people can agree they've really never been that great at it. I'm hoping they can kind of step up, but one or two things is going to happen at this point, I think. Either A, they're going to balance for the best builds, and they're going to release content for the best builds, in which case everyone's going to have to meta whore, because it's not like... In a lot of other games, you don't need to meta whore, like you can struggle bus your way through things, but the balance difference right now is it truly, if you look at two different streams of two different people, you can truly feel like they're almost playing different games just based on a lot of what they're doing. Okay. Added a new lightning damage and electrocute cluster to the passive tree in between the ranger and monk sections. Cool, I guess. It is now more difficult to chain freeze enemies by reducing the amount of freeze buildup applied after a freeze has been applied. It's definitely a good thing. Cast on freeze was still really overpowered. Freeze was still itself, just as a mechanic, outrageously overpowered. I think a lot of videos have been shown of people just chain freezing the pinnacle bosses. So these are the big bosses that are supposed to be really hard to beat, and people were just chain freezing them. So that surely was not a good thing. That's surely not the challenging content that we were promised. The Hunter's Talisman notable now grants +1 charm slot. The small passive skill, blah, 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 blah. So there's a notable, you can get a charm slot from your skill points now. Do you want it? Go grab it. It's not, okay, cool. Support and skill and support gem balance. Since launch, we've unfortunately had to nerf a few skills that were far too overpowered, which I think everyone should have suspected. Like, right when you launch a game like this, obviously people are going to rush out and they're going to be like, oh, what if you did this, 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 and this? And the developer is going to be like, oh, we never thought about that. And then it's crazy overpowered and they have to nerf it. And then when they nerf it, people are going to be like, oh, what if you do this, 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 and this? And the developers are going to be like, oh, we never thought about that either. And then they're going to have to nerf it. And then they're going to be like, oh, well, what if we do this, 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 this? And then Joe and Bob are going to look at each other, and Joe's going to be like, Bob, when did you add that to the game? And Bob's going to be like, when did you add that to the game? And they're going to be like, we had no idea both those things could work together like that, because we didn't, you know. And so the problem is going to be, expect a lot of nerfs and try to not get too salty at them. There's some things that even my class have that I do think should be toned down a little bit. So I know the community hates nerfs, but nerfs keep the game fair and fun. I know people think nerf equal no fun, but like at the end of the day, in a challenging game, how frustrating would it be if your favorite build was just really, really overpowered and you couldn't really enjoy the game that other people were enjoying? Okay. How do we define overpowered? Basically, it's a situation in which a certain skill is so powerful that players feel no other method of playing the game is viable. which is generally what happens in ARPGs. And they're basically saying what I was going to say earlier. If they're going to make a challenging endgame, if they're going to make this stuff actually skillful to beat, then you can't have certain builds that just are way overpowered and trashing the content. And I'm not saying like if you're really good at the game, yeah, like if you're really good at the game, you can probably do anything on anything, right? But if the entire community at large is gravitating towards a certain build because it's a path of least resistance, in other words, you know, if you want to look at the game as is, look at how many people have re-rolled out a warrior to go play, you know, bow users, right? And so when we look at the path of least resistance, what is giving you the least resistance to play, and everyone's gravitating towards a certain thing, then that thing should probably be nerfed. Yes, in fact, most of the time it should be nerfed, with the few exceptions that like there's literally nothing better to do. Because in that situation, you know, like, what are you going to do? Like, there's some things, sometimes it's just like you're given 3 options and like 2 of the options are so bad that obviously everyone's going to choose a good option, right? So like, it's not like the 3rd option is just like blatantly overpowered. It just means the other 2 options suck. Generally speaking, we're trying to do this in a way that doesn't make a build bad, but we can make mistakes. Ideally, any true meta shifting changes will only happen at the same time as a content patch with a new league to play in. My only concern, and I might talk about this later in another video, leagues in Path of Exile tend to get very dead very quickly as the meta gets stagnant, as the best builds get decided, and as people start making overpowered builds that are kind of boring to play, or in other words, as people min-max the fun out of the game, which can happen really, really quickly. That's generally when the developers should be making changes. But if they're not making changes there, well, okay, you know what? Rather than just say it, let me just show you guys. Path of Exile 1 loses its player base a lot. Like, a lot. Like, Path of Exile, its player base, by a month into every season, their player base is halved. 2 months into a season, they have no player base anymore. Okay? So, it's very clear to me, as someone who looks at this, that Path of Exile has an issue where, yes, once you min-max the fun out of the game, everyone quits. Halfway into a season, about only 2/5 of the player base is left, ever. That's true for every single season. 2/5 of the player base is gone. Or sorry, 3/5 of the player base is gone, and only 2/5 of the player base remains a month into every season. The developers probably need to do a little bit of a better job on making sure that it remains fun and interesting to play in a season, especially if they're trying to have this excessively big late game, and if they're trying to have this as be a more live servicey kind of game rather than a seasonal game. Now, it's fine to have it be a seasonal game as it is in the past, but that doesn't really seem to be what they're going for, and I'm just a bit worried that if you continue to let players min-max the fun out of the game, then they're just going to continue to min-max the fun out of the game. And then what was the point of all this? Okay, but that doesn't mean we haven't been looking at underpowered skills and support gems. We've got a couple of changes planned which should improve some of these skills. The full list of changes will be in the patch notes, but here's a sample of what you can expect. Improvements to Rolling Slam and all shield skills in the mace section. Rolling Slam is so catastrophically underpowered, and it's bugged. The second slam doesn't even get Aftershock damage. So Rolling Slam is so catastrophically underpowered, it makes the entire warrior early game really underpowered and hard to play. Rolling Slam is so catastrophically bad right now. I'm really glad it got singled out. Rolling Slam is actually especially frustrating because it would be the best ability in a lot of different builds, but it literally doesn't, A, it doesn't work, and B, it's just so catastrophically underpowered that it practically doesn't even matter. Even with perfect synergy, and if it worked, it would still be bad. Shield spells, there is one good shield skill, Magma Barrier, but that's not in the mace section, so I do like how they singled that out. Magma Barrier is doing really good right now. There's a build with it that I do that is actually kind of crazy, but the mace skills are all laughably undertuned. And by laughably undertuned, I mean they are dealing like a 10th of the damage. If you increase their damage by 10 times, Shield Charge is the only ability that does any damage. you would have to increase the other abilities damage by like 10 times to get them to be relevant. It's crazy how underpowered they are. You will literally only use shield charge, and you will only use it for a map movement ability. All three of their abilities are just so extremely... I literally don't think it was play tested. I think they actually just made the abilities, made sure they animated properly, and just never actually loaded into the game and actually like attacked an enemy mob with them, because they are so outrageously bad. Additionally, and this I was going to earlier, a lot of these shield abilities tend to be more combo focused, where, as I've mentioned, you don't really have time to combo in the late game. So it really calls into question what they do. They could probably make Resonating Shield a good AoE ability. It'd be a bit boring, and people would probably get bored of it. Maybe they wouldn't, but at any rate, I think Resonating Shield could maybe work. Shield Slam with some damage buffs could probably work, and that would leave the Shield Wall, which... I'm not really sure how they're going to get Shield Wall to be viable other than giving it like a 20 times damage boost. It would literally need to be times by 20 to be like, I mean, maybe that'd be like 15 times more damage would probably be good. But it's just, especially the bonus Shield Wall, it takes 1.5 seconds to cast. It takes 1.5 seconds to cast an emergency wall around you, and it doesn't even block AoEs. Something went wrong with the shield abilities. Improvement to various bow skills, especially the skills used to generate frenzy charges. So once again, basically no ranger or whatever the class is called in this version of the game. None of them are actually using frenzy. They're all just AoE one-shotting everything. I'm not really sure how the developers are going to get people to combo so long as every enemy just dies to one AoE. There's no real point to comboing. Now, they could be just trying to balance this for the campaign. So maybe they're trying to like tune the campaign balance and then they'll work on endgame. But it doesn't, to me, it doesn't seem they really intend the endgame to be anything more than AoE mashing. So unless you can AoE mash really, really hard, there's practically no point to, you know, using low damage abilities that buff other abilities right now. Yeah. Improvements to bone spells and chaos damage over time spells in the occult section. So these were just catastrophically underpowered as well. I don't think I saw a single player use a single bone skill ever. No, I saw one person use it like as a joke. That's about it. As for chaos over time, literally haven't seen one person play it ever. Both these, well, at the very least, chaos damage over time suffers from a problem where I have mentioned this and I have to mention it again. Damage over time effects as you get into the end game really start to suffer, because you can either click a button and clear half the map, or you can click a button and start damaging a bunch of people who will eventually die. Okay. Improvements to various crossbow skills, especially those at higher tiers. So crossbow is an issue where, you know, once again, I have to mention it. It's like, it's such a big problem. It's affecting the entire game. There's no point in using any crossbow skills because they AoE one-shot everything across the map. Well, I guess crossbow doesn't AoE one-shot. It more like AoE AK-47s everything. So the developers are going to, basically, once you reach level, 80, the amount of health enemy mobs have should be, doubled. They should have less quantity and their health should be doubled. I really can't think of any other way to discourage people from doing nothing but just AoEing, because no ability will matter so long as enemies have no HP. They do not survive anything. ARPG developers constantly run into issues with designing enemies because they die in 1 to 2 hits, so why give them abilities? They gave the enemies abilities, and then in the end game, they made them die in 1 to 2 hits. So, I guess I keep asking this question, what was the point of all this? Improvements to some of the underachieving quarterstaff abilities. So, I kind of don't like they were a bit vague here, but whenever they patch, might be today, tomorrow, whenever, I guess maybe we'll see what they're actually doing. My only concern, and I'm a bit afraid of this, is that all the abilities that are more combo oriented, they just end up buffing really hard. So then all the combo abilities are then just used to also AoE, if you know what I mean. I'm a bit afraid that, for example, Resonating Strike in the shield skill, Resonating Strike is supposed to be like a defensive ability that shreds armor. My concern is they're just going to make it scale so hard and do so much damage. They're just going to see warriors like running into people and just like, just bonk, bonk, bonk on their shield. And then everyone around them just explodes. The Warcry build sure does not look that interesting to play. I don't really know who plays that sort of build. Like, they just perma CC every enemy mob until they explode. I guess it's funny, but it doesn't look fun to play. And my concern is we're going to get another build out of Resonating Strike. But to be honest, I'm not really sure what Resonating will do, because all you do is bonk your shield until people's armor is shred. But you're not going to shred their armor. You're just going to AoE them. You're just going to kill them all in one hit. Why would I shred their armor when I could just AoE them? I don't know. We'll see. Alongside all these skill gem improvements, we've also done a pass over the support gems. We've added 2 new supports and remove or lessen the penalties of many others, notably the fire, lightning, and cold exposure supports. What we need right now is a support gem that does not allow an ability to proc stuns. In other words, a support gem that, like, this ability gets plus 15% damage, but cannot stun an enemy more than 80%. Why? Because Bone Shatter has a really annoying issue. As you get into the later game, you'll passively get more damage through putting abilities in nodes, or just your passive level improvements, or just you're improving your gear. You will constantly run into issues where enemies are so squishy that if you're trying to prep enemies for Bone Shatter, now Bone Shatter needs enemies damaged but not stunned, you will constantly run into the issue where they will instantly get stunned from the slightest breeze because they just have no HP and take so much damage. I've literally had to start debuffing, using support gems literally to just reduce the damage on some abilities, just so that they can set up Bone Shatter. So if any developer is listening, please, I beg, a support gem that does not allow an ability to proc the stun, but just sets up the stun, and then give it like a 15% damage boost so that it scales on par with other supports. Anyway, added the Tremor support gem, which can be used to give up to multiple more aftershocks to skills with a damage penalty. So I kind of hope this isn't another RNG aftershock. RNG aftershock is kind of annoying to play. It either does or it doesn't, and you can't really control it, and it's not really consistent, and it's not really fun, and it's not really enjoyable. Just give us like an aftershock meter, an aftershock Mar or something, I don't really know. Allow us to like generate aftershocks through all the different percent modifiers to generate an aftershock, and then just give it a guaranteed aftershock once you've built it up. I think that would be the best way to do it. Now, my problem with aftershock right now is Supercharged Slam. See, Supercharged Slam does 20% more damage every time it aftershocks. The obvious problem here is it already has so many aftershocks in the ability itself that adding a lot of aftershock support is going to push Supercharged Slam into an area where it will be used to just one-shot bosses again. That's my concern, because a 20% more that can continue to repeat, 20% more, 20% more, 20% more, that can get really, really, really out of hand. So that's just my one concern, that aftershock skills right now are kind of choked down by Supercharged Slam, because if it's too good, then Supercharged Slam is overpowered with it. If it's not good enough, Supercharged Slam will still probably use it, just not as well. Okay. Added the Bidding support gem, which can be used to give more damage to the control skills of supported minions. I have heard that the control skill of supported minions wasn't very good once you scaled up, so just, I don't know, emphasizing that a little bit probably helps out minions to feel better. The Fire Exposure, Lightning Exposure, and Cold Exposure support gems no longer penalize damage of supported skills. They now have a mana cost multiplier of 120%. That's probably fair. The support gems right now that reduce the damage of an ability to get another effect are generally not very good or strong. One, because dotting enemies is not really that big a deal. For the most part, bosses are generally not going to be tanky enough to really care. There are some abilities you can quick charge a bleed or an ignite at the start of a boss fight, and you can use it to kind of burst them down. That's really all you're doing. You're just bursting them down with big dot, right? You're not like bleeding them over the course of a fight or anything. So putting a huge damage penalty on these support gems that are trying to like enhance dot builds it hasn't really improved the game. It's just made it so that dot builds are like really, really, really weirdly hard to play. Yeah. There are also some notable nerfs to a few of the remaining overachieving skills. Skeletal Arsonist Spirit costs now match the other 2 Skeleton Mages. This should result in a slight decrease in the number of Arsonists at a higher level. Skeletal Arsonist, for some reason, took less Spirit. I don't know why. It made you get more of them. Now you get the same amount of them. It seems to have been a little bit of an oversight. A nerf to the damage over time component on the very high levels of Tornado and Vine Arrows. These were never intended to be dealing damage themselves, but more so act as a way for other skills to propagate damage. Which, there is a problem here, and I do see it. I already see it starting with things like this. Enemy mobs have so little HP at the high end that the only thing that matters is how much AoE you do. Even small amounts of AoE, once you get enough damage, can start killing the enemies very, very easily because they just never really get tankier in the endgame. They stay about the same level of tankiness forever. And so small amounts of AoE damage can start killing all the enemy normal mobs, which A, doesn't really seem intended, and B, kind of starts really making some builds dumb. Like the Sparks build where you just fill the whole map with very low damage sparks, but wait, it kills everything, so it doesn't really matter. Okay. Magnetic Salvo can now only use your stuck lightning arrows as opposed to those created by your party members, which is fair. It's kind of a niche nerf to playing Magnetic Salvo with another friend, so, you know, okay. As we wind down for the holiday season, we wanted to thank you all for our most successful launch so far. And I do think it's good. I think the campaign is absolutely amazing. Honest to God, as much as I complain about the late game, I think the current campaign is so outrageously good that if they can get the end game to play like that campaign, I think they would literally invalidate every other ARPG in existence, and there would be actually no reason to ever play any game that is not Path of Exile 2. The campaign plays and is so good, it's insane. But again, we can already see the threads pulling out here, where the developers liked the campaign, they enjoyed making the campaign, but it seems very much that they want the endgame to be spamming AoEs. They want the slow-paced, combo-y gameplay to go away, and they want you to go spam AoEs. That makes it play like every other ARPG out there, where the only viable build is AoE spam, which is fine, but it's just going to lose a lot of the players who, right now we can already see that a lot of the players are finishing the campaign. Sorry, power gamers, most people don't play this game for 10 hours a day, but a lot of the people, the first week is over, they're finishing the campaign, and they're going, wow, that was a wonderful campaign. They get to the end game, and they go, yeah, I don't really feel like playing that. That's not for me. And I kind of hope the developers make some changes or do something, because when most of those players come to believe that that's going to be the end game, a lot of them are probably going to consider this a one and done game where they beat the campaign, they're done, and they just move on. And that's really, I don't think, what the developers want, and I don't think that's what they should do. So I'm kind of hoping, although I can see the wind blowing in this direction, I'm kind of hoping this doesn't just become another AoE masher game. Yeah, that's all. Other than that, though, pretty much good changes all around. In fact, not even pretty much, just good changes all around. Really addressing some issues, maybe not addressing them hard enough. I definitely think this change is really good. I'd rather the endgame be a little bit too easy right now than it be in its current state, where it's actually just maddening to play. The amount of times you die from something and you just look at your screen and you're just like, oh, I didn't see one purple orb, and I died from full HP to one purple orb. Cool. Like, the amount of times that happened to me was maddening, and eventually I powered through and I geared up and I got all that, but I don't think your average player will put up with that, especially with how punishing it is to die in the endgame content. You don't want to be dying in the endgame content right now. It's pretty brutal. So that's this video. Thank you all for watching. Thank you all for being here. Make sure to leave a comment, like, subscribe, do all that stuff. And as always, you know, if you disagree with any of my opinions, just leave a comment. Make sure to disagree. That's fine. And thank you all for being here. Thank you, everybody. And as always, have a great rest of your day.